I'm here to welcome you to tonight's event at the Camrose Public Library. I'd like to thank you all again for coming, and many thanks to the library for hosting us this evening. My name is Ian Wilson, for those who don't know me, and I'm director of the Chester Ronning Center for the Study of Religion and Public Life, which is a research center here at the University of Alberta's Augustana campus in Camrose. Our distinguished guest tonight is Dr. Molly Worthen. Molly comes to us from the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, where she is an associate professor and director of the honors program in the history department there. But she is no stranger to Alberta. She first visited our Canadian province in 2001 as an undergraduate university student, when she came to do fieldwork amongst an Old Believer Russian Orthodox community about 4 hours northeast of Edmonton. Her host on that trip was none other than David Goa, native Camrosian and founding director of the Chester Ronning Center. In 2008, David hosted her again, this time, or that time, as a visiting lecturer at the center. The occasion of Molly's visit then was the American presidential election, the historic contest between John McCain and Barack Obama. In fact, she gave one of her lectures on the actual election day as the United States elected its first ever African-American president. It is fitting that she would return again, almost exactly 10 years later, on the near eve of midterm elections in the United States, in the midst of Donald Trump's presidential term. Regardless of one's political or religious affiliations or inclinations, I think we can all agree that the times they have changed. Many of the political divisions on public display in 2008 seem quaint in today's political climate. That said, the historical foundations of those divisions are, of course, the same. Today, Molly will help us situate the current political climate within that larger historical context, especially in relation to the history of Christianity in North America. Her talk will highlight the complexity of evangelicalism in the US and in Canada, and how that complexity relates to the rise of Trumpism and the current political discourse. There is no scholar better suited to give this lecture. Molly is one of the Academy's premier historians of American religion. Her book, which I have a copy of here, Apostles of Reason, which is an intellectual history of American evangelicalism and which was published by Oxford University Press, has been called, quote, an authoritative guide to the past 6 decades of American evangelical Christianity, and, quote, required reading for any student or scholar of evangelicalism. And, to boot, she's a very accomplished journalist, having reported on religion and politics for media outlets like the New York Times, Slate, the New Yorker, Foreign Policy, and the American Prospect. I'm delighted that she could be here with us in Camrose this evening, and I look forward to her lecture. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Molly Worthen.
Thank you so much for being here tonight. Thank you, Ian, for that very generous introduction. I must apologize for my voice. I caught a daycare bug from my daughter. She was sick for about 15 minutes. I've been sick for a couple of weeks, and as she says, I have a frog in my mouth. So if you can't hear me, wave your hand or something. As Ian said, I'm back after 10 years, and I still remember my last visit to Camrose quite vividly. I remember watching the election returns come in that night in a room full of smiling, laughing, crying Canadians, and it really brought home to me the international significance of that election. And now here I am to talk to you about a very different president whose victory also had international significance, I think it's fair to say. To a lot of people, the result of the 2016 US presidential election was not the obvious next chapter in American history. Trump's victory caught a lot of people, conservatives and liberals, by surprise. And I found that for many of us who study this history, trying to figure out what the heck happened has become kind of a part-time job over the last couple of years. And tonight I'm just going to focus on one piece of that big question, and that's how to explain the key support that Trump received from white American evangelicals. 81% of American evangelicals who voted cast their vote for Donald Trump, and his approval ratings among them remain very high. A lot of people have wondered about this alliance between evangelical Christians and a man who is certainly one of the least personally moral, least personally devout men ever to occupy the White House. Plus, there is this deeper question of white evangelicals' very consistent loyalty in recent decades to one political party in the United States. And it makes an interesting contrast to Canada. I mean, if you take the 2015 federal election, fully half of Canadian evangelicals did not vote Conservative. I'm going to suggest a few reasons why all of this should not be surprising at all, and I'll draw some comparisons between Canadian and American Christianity and culture and speculate on just how weirdly American the phenomenon of Trump and his evangelical support truly is. I think any successful politician wins votes because he or she tells supporters a story they want to believe, a story about what their country is and who they are that aligns with stories that they are already telling themselves. And I think Trump masterfully played on and reinforced three stories that evangelicals like to believe. The first is a story about the role of government and the defense of religious liberty. The second is a story about women. And the third is a story about experts and discerning truth. And I'll say a bit more about each one of these in order. Now, this will involve a bit of a dive into the history of theology. And I want to be clear that by dwelling on ideas, I'm not dismissing less, say, intellectual lenses on people's political motivations, racial injustice or prejudice, economic resentment, even the hardwiring of human psychology. All of that is very important. But I think for many humans, ideology becomes this powerful framework that helps precognitive motivations coalesce and make sense to people. So it's worth understanding these ideas and where they come from. First, let me take up this matter of government, because I think it's a pretty substantial feature of white evangelical political opinion that has confused observers since long before Trump. In the Gospels, Jesus seems to have a fair amount of concern for the poor. He tells his disciples to give to the poor. He says, invite the poor to your feasts. And so to many liberal observers, it seems like this should translate into Christians supporting progressive taxation and expanding public welfare. That seems like the kind of modern political consequence. And yet many evangelicals, though by no means all of them, tend to reject these policies, even though many of them would stand to benefit personally from a more generous social safety net. Instead, many white evangelicals opt for what I call a selective libertarianism. That is, they have a pretty hostile view toward the social safety net, but their worldview is not exactly a small government vision. They love how Trump has intervened quite aggressively on several political issues. Trade and immigration are good examples. There are at least two main reasons for this, and they both have to do with how evangelicals came to view biblical authority in particular historical contexts. The first is the late 18th century, when many American evangelicals came to view the Bible as really a call to political rebellion. So yes, Here I'm going to make the cliche American move and start with the revolution. But the revolution, it really is worth dwelling on. It is important. I like the example of the famous Baptist preacher named Isaac Backus. He grew up in New England. He grew up in kind of the Puritan context that had first thrown off the authority of the Anglican Church. Then he became a Baptist, so he rejected the authority even of the Puritans' Congregationalist church. And now here he was rejecting the authority of the king. Now this guy rode thousands of miles on horseback every year, going from tiny church to church in the countryside, haranguing people about their duty as Christians to rise up. He gave sermons mocking what he called the doctrine of passive obedience to the king. And he said essentially, if you read the Bible, your job is to throw off this tyrant. Backus represents this crucial moment in American history when American evangelicalism became fused to late 18th century Republican politics. And I mean Republican small r, not the modern party. When the language of individual conversion to Christ and individual political freedoms merged, and the dominant religious tradition in America became entwined with this suspicion of centralized authority, suspicion of a powerful federal government. Now this is very different from the church-state relationships and ideas about authority that emerged here in Canada. And there are loads of reasons for this. It's so complicated, but to just rattle off a few things that we should keep in mind. British rule began quite later here. So you did not have the period of benign neglect that American colonies enjoyed for roughly the first 60 years or so of the 17th century, when the British had other things distracting them, particularly a civil war, that meant that the southern colonies got used to kind of doing what they wanted with a fairly low level of interference. Also in Canada, from the beginning of British control, there was this pressing need to manage relations with a distinct French Catholic civilization. And I think you see a pragmatic recognition that the government had to be involved in mediating between religious minorities and majorities. The demographics of settling British colonists made a difference as well. Those early waves of migration south of the border were full of dissenter Protestants, kind of in the mold of Isaac Backus. I mean, they were his ancestors. So they had various axes to grind against the established church and government in their home countries, especially England, but not only England. That anti-establishment sentiment just was not nearly so powerful here in Canada. And of course, the big thing to note is that Canada did not have a revolution. I mean, yes, you had a series of rebellions which had profound consequences for the reform of colonial government and the path toward confederation. But I always tell my students that cliche that is key to understanding Canadian history: evolution, not revolution. I make them chant it in my lecture hall on the eve of their midterm. Get it straight and you can answer so much. If I can make one giant, but I think still fairly useful oversimplification, it's to say that the American Revolution had the effect of lopping off one end of the 18th century British political, ideological spectrum. And it lopped off the big government, what you can call the Tory end of the spectrum. So ever since, the mainstream of American political problem solving has been a lot narrower than what you have here in Canada. A lot more hostile to big government, whether it's on the Tory right or the Democratic Socialist left. The Canadian political spectrum has simply remained a lot broader not as hostile to giving power to a central authority. Now, I will grant that the political history of Alberta is unique, and the culture here has nurtured a community of Christian libertarians who in some ways are quite similar to their American cousins. And I'd love to hear some of your reflections on that, maybe in our discussion. Let me add a couple more caveats. Historically, conservative evangelicals have absolutely, occasionally, been quite happy to use the power of big government to advance a particular moral vision. The example of the campaign for prohibition of alcohol comes to mind. So we have, on the one hand, a suspicion of centralized government if it might threaten Christian liberty, however you define that. And on the other, we have a taste for mobilizing government tools to police morality and maintain cultural authority. We have both things at once. So what I'm calling this selective libertarianism has lent a certain flexibility to evangelical political ideology, a tendency to both welcome an authoritarian leader like Trump and also cheer his promises to strip away certain categories of regulation and government authority. Here's another caveat. Some evangelicals have absolutely had different visions of state power. So there has always been, I think, something you could call an evangelical left, a kind of dissenter, progressive strain in this tradition. But if you want to understand the appeal of a president who undermines our incompetent efforts toward universal health care, who cuts taxes, you really have to go back to the Revolution, if not to the Puritans, to this time when evangelicals came to think that Christians could not be completely free to obey the authority of the Bible without placing strong limits on the power of the state. I'll add a third qualification as well, and that is that I am not saying that conservative white American evangelicals have no heart for the poor. And I think this is something that secular observers often really do not understand. The conservative churches near where I live in North Carolina do pretty amazing service work in the community, whether it's for refugees, ESL students, homeless people, other needy groups. But they believe that the church and the community should be the agents of this, rather than the government. They think progressives who seek to redistribute wealth or otherwise challenge fundamental sources of inequality are kind of naively playing into the hands of would-be totalitarian social engineers, and they simply don't get the reality of original sin and what it really means. Or the arc toward the eschaton, the end times, and the ultimate fact that the deepest injustices in our society will not change until Jesus comes again. If you look at the history, white evangelicals have not been inclined to support major efforts in Washington to redistribute wealth or otherwise fundamentally change structural features of our society, especially if this has meant giving tax dollars to people that do not look like them, namely immigrants and non-white people. And this points us to another crucial difference between Canadian and American history, right? I mean, the legacy of race-based chattel slavery and what it has meant for how white Americans have policed the boundaries of their community and decided who deserves care and who is undeserving. The basic problem here, cultivating empathy in a diverse community, this is a pretty universal human problem. This is not something that humans, historically, any of us are really all that good at. The history of Christianity in the modern West is totally intertwined with white supremacy, and that is especially true in the United States. You may have noticed that I've been using the term evangelicalism as essentially a white word, and there are some problems with doing that because there are loads of non-white conservative Protestants. But the ones that I meet in the States are often pretty reluctant to call themselves evangelical. They don't want to get caught up in the culture wars, which are a set of fights that are preoccupy white Christians far more in many cases than Christians of color. And because historically white evangelicals have a pretty bad record on racial justice. Now, there are important exceptions. There were, of course, some evangelical abolitionists and civil rights activists, but far more of them used the Bible to justify slavery. After the Civil War, they continued to preach that God banned the intermingling of the races. And a century later, they were founding private Christian schools to take their kids out of desegregated public schools. And in fact, when the Supreme Court in 1971 revoked the tax exemption of these private Christian academies, saying, you may say what you're doing is Christian education, but you are de facto a segregationist school. You're only teaching white students. This produced a groundswell of evangelical anger. From the evangelical perspective, this was an infringement on their religious liberty to educate their kids as they wanted. And many scholars, and in fact many organizers of the Christian right within the movement, point to that as really the main catalyst for the modern religious right in the United States. Not abortion, not any of the other issues you might name. My point here is that when Donald Trump tells white evangelicals that he will defend their religious liberty, that he will make America great again like it used to be, that he won't use the tools of government to assist anyone who doesn't deserve it, he is, at least for some of his followers, tapping into a very particular American racial politics with a very long history. Now let me turn to the second topic that Trump has capitalized on, and that's white evangelicals' attitudes toward women and authority. Lately, there has been just a whole mess of books and articles about the socioeconomic decline of white men in America, and the West more broadly, I think, but particularly in America. You may have run across books by people like Hannah Rosin. She wrote a book called The End of Men, which kind of sums up the apocalyptic argument in her title, or J.D. Vance's memoir about his childhood in Appalachia, Hillbilly Elegy. And you might have heard the common line on Hillary Clinton, that for many American men, she came to represent everything about modernity that they felt had emasculated them. What I'd like to add to this is a longer and specifically evangelical history, and also a point about the Bible. First, since as long as anyone has been keeping track of church attendance, women have made up the majority of churchgoers in pretty much every modern religious community. And that's not just limited to Christianity. There are a few exceptions, but this is the overwhelming pattern for as long as we have really good evidence. And for almost that long, so for at least the past couple hundred years, if not longer, church leaders have been worried about what they call the feminization of the church. The men are not showing up. And as a result, the emasculation of muscular Christianity, brave, physically courageous, independent Christian men. Now combine this with the kind of general crisis of masculinity that we've had in the West in a kind of on-again, off-again way since, I don't know, the mid-19th century, as a result of the urbanization of the economy, the decline of the small independent farmer, and the rise of the middle manager who spends his days pushing papers around and getting bossed around by someone else and feeling like he has no autonomy. you have this context, this broader cultural context, in which men, particularly conservative white Christian men, were getting nervous about women's authority and the decline of their own long before, suffragettes or any kind of organized feminist movement. Now, if you go into the church archives and you follow the arguments about things like whether female missionaries should be allowed to preach, or whether churches ought to ordain women as deacons or ministers, you will run into the same Bible verses over and over, particularly Paul's prohibitions on women speaking in church. And you'll see an assertion that believing in the inerrant truth, the perfect truth of the Bible, requires strict, unchanging gender roles. The idea here is that the Bible contains perfect truths that must stand for all time, and that Christians ought to use it as a science textbook, as a history textbook, and as an infallible guide to human sexuality. Evangelicals who condemn gay marriage will point to Paul's letter to the Romans, the first chapter, where he does seem to condemn homosexual sex. They will point to the creation narrative in Genesis to support the idea that God created two fixed genders and was pretty clear to Eve, told woman that man would rule over her forever. And the logic is, well, if God is perfect and unchanging, and this book is God-breathed, his revelation has to be immune to any change as well. The interesting thing is that this particular way of thinking about the Bible's authority, what I'm calling the doctrine of biblical inerrancy, is not timeless and universal, although it has become very influential today. You can trace the history of this way of thinking back to a particular set of fights that one group of Protestant theologians was having in the 17th century against some scientists and philosophers who they really felt were challenging the authority of the Bible. And I won't get into the details. We can talk about it in the Q&A if you're interested. My main point is simply that there's a particular history there, and it actually doesn't speak for the whole conservative Protestant tradition. Many other conservative Protestants have had different takes on this. The Wesleyan tradition, so that means the Methodist, Church of the Nazarene, denominations in that family, instructed believers to think of Christ himself rather than Scripture as God's ultimate, most perfect revelation, and to read the Bible with the aid of human reason, church tradition, and personal spiritual experience. Wesleyans have been very influential in Canada, particularly. Pentecostals are pretty interesting here as well. Most Pentecostals today are quite conservative, but their faith that the Holy Spirit can do some crazy stuff. I mean, it's this kind of radical seed in their own tradition. In the early revivals at the turn of the century that launched the modern Pentecostal movement, the Holy Spirit encouraged those first Pentecostals to do all kinds of things that were very taboo. I mean, women were getting up and preaching. Blacks, whites, and Latinos were worshiping in the same space in segregated communities. So we have these potential kind of dissenter strains here. But think about the big trend lines of North American culture over the last century or so. Women have gained enormously in political and economic power. A flood of immigrants has transformed both our countries. Many liberal Christians have quite radically changed their reading of the Bible to accommodate new science and historical discoveries, and to generally say the Bible is still an authority, the authority on salvation, but maybe not so much on some of these other things. So it makes sense that a lot of conservatives said, wait a second, the Bible has no errors in it. The Bible should be able to answer science on its own terms. It should be able to empower Christian men to govern their own families, including their wives and their daughters. I told you a minute ago that there are these other conservative Protestant resources for developing a theology of gender equality. You don't have to be, some kind of crazy Quaker to recover some what we call progressive ideas, to recover Wesleyan ideas of the gradual perfection of humans over time. I mean, an interesting feature of Wesleyan thinking on this is that God has intended for us to become more Christ-like over time. And so maybe the rules he imposed on the first century, he did not intend to apply forever. That was kind of our adolescence as a species. You also have those Pentecostal notions that seem like they could overturn worldly hierarchies. But I think there's a problem here, and it's that as far as I know, there really aren't good biblical proof texts or theological traditions for explaining away the decline of white male authority in modern America. Now, there are ways to draw on theology to talk about economic haves and have-nots, absolutely, particularly the social gospel and its ideas of institutionalized collective sin and the need for top-down structural reform. But that is really at odds with the selective libertarian, small government, small community vision that I described to you. Plus, the masculinity piece is so important here. For many of these evangelicals, their Jesus was not meek and mild. He was manly. They had disappointed him. These men have not had a good way to account for their sense of diminishment, their sense of loss of status and respect theologically. And here is where I think we can start to understand the many, many evangelical women who voted for Trump, as well as the men. These two trends, the ascending place of women and the declining status of men, are not abstract, independent demographic variables. They are totally intertwined in the same families, under the same roof. In a family where the man is no longer the breadwinner, where he feels he has no dignity, he has no chance of achieving his father's or his grandfather's status, where the women in his life have seen him demeaned, they've watched him become petty, they've watched him drift away from the church, perhaps we can start to understand the staying power of this hierarchical theology of gender and the perverse appeal, even to women, of Trump's strongman, sort of faux masculinity. Now, some of this narrative applies to the experience of conservative white Christians in Canada. I think you could see why, in theory, they might go for a slogan like "Make Canada Great Again." Until about 1960, rates of church attendance were actually higher in Canada than they were in the United States. And if you were, say, a white Protestant man in the Anglophone provinces, or you were a Catholic man in Quebec, it probably felt like you were on top of a heap. And it's kind of been downhill from there in a lot of ways. And there is a strain of what you could call American-style fundamentalism in Canadian history. You see it in Alberta's own Bible Bill Aberhart. You see it in the great Toronto Baptist fundamentalist T.T. Shields. But conservative evangelicals have always been a smaller proportion of your population. They've held steady for the last century or so at about 10%. This is compared to at least 25% in the United States. I would say that conservative white evangelicals never enjoyed the same kind of comfortable cultural hegemony in Canada that they did south of the border. Now, they have a very vexed relationship with secularization and Canadian pluralism, for sure. But I wonder whether evangelical churches here have perhaps more fully embraced the ethos of multiculturalism, or at least acquiesced to it, not just because it's become a persuasive part of Canadian national identity for a lot of Canadians, but also because I think these churches see recruiting immigrants from East Asia, from the global south, as maybe the last best hope for keeping their congregations afloat. Now, it's not a perfect strategy. Something like just 16% of new immigrants to Canada are evangelical. And I'll add to that the perhaps obvious point that the growth of your welfare state over the past half century, your natural resources boom, have both softened the economic impact of globalization and made social inequality less extreme. And so perhaps there is less anxiety about status loss and less real suffering than in the United States. All right, I've talked about visions of government and community. I've talked about gender, authority, and the role of the Bible. The third narrative I want to mention is a story of fake news. So much of Trump's appeal does not start with ideology. It starts with the alternative reality that he creates. I've told you that conservative evangelicals have this long tradition of defending the Bible against the incursions of modern scholarship. And I think that this primed them to believe Trump's alternative reality and dismiss unwelcome information as fake news from bogus experts. When people complain about the fact that liberals and conservatives seem to live in separate media universes and a substantial number of them feel at liberty to decide what is fact and what is not, they sometimes blame postmodernism. Now, I have as many crotchety complaints about the vague bogeyman of postmodernity as anybody, and that's part of the story perhaps, but actually there's a much longer, more straightforward history to explain why this way of thinking has special appeal to conservative evangelicals. It goes back to the late 19th century, to a Dutch theologian named Abraham Kuyper, who laid the groundwork, unintentionally, I think, for a new way of thinking about the way Christians argue with non-Christians. Up until this point, I would say most Christians, certainly most evangelicals, were very into natural theology. That is, taking evidence from the natural world to argue for the existence of God. Kuyper moved away from natural theology, from trying so hard to prove the truth of Christianity with empirical evidence available to all of us, and focused instead on presuppositions, on the foundational assumptions that distinguish a Christian worldview from a materialist one. This way of thinking came into full bloom, you could say, in the mid-20th century, in a school of thought called presuppositionalism. And that's a real mouthful, but the basic idea is not that complicated. It's simply that one can only accurately evaluate evidence out in the world if you are proceeding from the right assumptions, the right presuppositions. And the key one is the assumption of the truth of the inerrant Bible. If you don't start there, forget about it. So this gives you a very handy way to dismiss arguments or information you don't like. You can just say that your opponent's presuppositions are false, and voila, it's fake news. You can change the channel. I spent a lot of time in my last book tracing the influence of this way of thinking on some of the leading evangelical activists and public intellectual types. People like the evangelist and culture warrior Francis Schaeffer. This guy was a kind of a wandering cultural prophet who was very popular among American evangelicals from the 60s into the 1980s. He played a huge role in mobilizing the evangelical pro-life movement, for example, And Schaeffer and his colleagues rather brilliantly use this way of thinking, this presuppositionalist stuff, packaged in the slogans of the Christian worldview versus the secular humanist worldview, to give evangelicals a way to talk back to secular scholarship and come away from the encounter feeling victorious, feeling savvy. So when Trump began speaking this way, he unwittingly capitalized on generations of evangelical intellectual practice. They are simply old hands at rejecting unwelcome ideas as fake news. Okay, so I've just given you, I think, a pretty deep theological dive. And this is not to imply that theology is always the main thing going on. My job description says that I'm an intellectual historian, so I think that means I'm required to think that ideas matter a lot, and I do. But I think the way they matter is that human beings create frameworks to organize our chaos, to make sense of our sufferings, our fears, our desires. Material forces often play a huge role in generating those fears and desires. But when we turn our gut reactions into political strategies, we often rely on ideologies. For American evangelicals, I've laid out 3 ideological frameworks that I think have had particular impact on America. So that selective libertarianism and concept of religious liberty that goes back to the Puritans by way of the Revolution and has evolved in the particular context of American white supremacy. Second, the doctrine of biblical inerrancy and its implications for gender roles. And third, this story of presuppositionalism and distrust of experts. These are all strategies that conservative evangelicals have used to make sense of massive change in America and their declining cultural authority. And they have used them to rally like-minded Christians to try to stop that decline at the ballot box. And in some ways, these strategies have worked. I mean, they did help elect Donald Trump. But if we step back and look at the big picture, we see that the Christian right has not managed to halt the drift toward a more pluralistic, a more secular America. An America that in a lot of ways is, over the long haul, becoming more like Canada. And conservative evangelicals see this, and it makes them dig in more. It makes them feel all the more certain of their commitments, their embattled status. And they have fused these convictions with a deep and rightful sense of economic anger, and also in some cases certainly a nativism that Trump has masterfully exploited. But I see some evangelicals, particularly college-age, millennial Christians, bucking against the Christian right, the old Christian right, and its ideas about politics. In my work as a journalist, I interview younger evangelicals with some frequency, and I often hear them reflecting on what their personal experience with sexual harassment has meant, their friendships with gay people has meant for their own theologies of sexuality and gender hierarchies. I hear them recoiling from the combative culture warrior style of politicians of their parents' generation and looking for different ways to relate to secular pluralism. I teach a lot of young Christians in my classes down in North Carolina, and they are a big reason why I teach my big lecture course, not just as a history of religion in America, which is typically the course that someone with my training would offer, but as a comparative history of religion in the US and Canada. Now, it's partly that I sort of have this sadistic reveling in making my students memorize the eccentric details of Bill Eberhardt's social credit policies. And I love watching the kind of baffled looks on their faces when we read the surrealist poets who helped inspire the Quiet Revolution. And I kind of have a thing for Tommy Douglas. I have a Tommy Douglas bobblehead on my office shelf. So it is partly my own eccentricities. But the real reason is bigger. Mainly, I want my students to learn about the places where Canadian religious history really diverges from what they know and what they take for granted. The much greater influence of the social gospel on the development of the Canadian welfare state. The reduced influence of fundamentalists in Canadian culture. The vastly different politics around the culture wars issues. Now, when I teach this, I don't make a political argument. I'm very careful about that. I do make an argument for historical contingency, for both the deep roots of certain features of modern politics, but also the fact that nothing had to turn out the way it did. There were human beings involved who made choices. At this moment, across the Western world, Christianity is at a crossroads. And I hope that studying the diversity of history helps us see that the future holds many more possible pathways than we might think. Thank you. So I'm very happy to take questions, if there are any, or hear your reactions. I think Ian will take charge of moderating.
Yes, I will call on folks. And just one, if you don't mind, Molly, one request is that you kind of either repeat or contextualize your comments, just in case anyone in the audience can't hear the question that's being asked. Then everyone will know kind of the context for your response. Please, questions, feedback, comments.
How do the evangelicals deal with Donald Trump's morality or lack thereof? And how does that coincide with their belief?
The question is, how do evangelicals deal with Donald Trump's moral indiscretions when their tradition, for its whole history, has in many ways very much emphasized personal holiness? This is a great question. Evangelicals in America have never been political idealists. They have always been political pragmatists. You can go back to the Revolution and find Virginia Baptists making a deal with the infidel Thomas Jefferson, even though this was a guy who snipped the miracles out of his copy of the New Testament, because they both shared the same view of disestablishment of the established church and religious freedom. And there are other cases where there's been this sense that some compromises are necessary in the interest of the greater victory of the gospel. There was a period in the 1990s, particularly during the Monica Lewinsky scandal and the immoral behavior of Bill Clinton, when conservative evangelicals really got on quite a high horse and made quite a lot of the expectations they imposed on leaders. And so it's a fair question, especially in more recent history, to ask that. I've heard evangelicals turn to the Hebrew Bible and say, God has chosen to use, immoral leaders and, sinful kings and, pagan peoples to discipline God's people or lead unwittingly the path to righteousness through all of human history, and this is simply another case of that. I would say there's a minority of evangelicals who actually cling to this, to me, rather thin hope that Donald Trump has had a sincere change of heart, and that when they pray over him, something has really happened. It's worth pointing out, putting aside Trump's several marriages and adultery and casinos and all the rest of it, and his apparent impious orientation toward the church, that from a certain angle, he is a very orthodox member of one of the most influential strains in modern Protestantism, particularly in America, and that's the prosperity gospel. I mean, his family church growing up was the Marble Collegiate Church of Norman Vincent Peale, the power of positive thinking guy, who was, if not exactly a prosperity gospel, or as we might think of it today, certainly laid the groundwork and advanced that idea that the only thing standing in between you and your success is, you know, your own bad thoughts. And forget about structural things in your life that might have set you back. It's all about naming what you want and claiming it. And so in this sense, his whole career and his idiom is very familiar to evangelicals and is not alien to their tradition.
Yeah, I was curious about, as far as I can see it, politicians are essentially motivated by the answer to the question, or at least the voter is motivated by the answer to the question, what have you done for me lately? So, in terms of the relationship between the evangelicals and Trump as the president, what has he done for them?
The question is, what has Trump actually done for evangelical voters? Given, you know, all of this justification that might have informed the original decision, why does his approval rating remain so high? Well, from the point of view of the Christian right, betting on Donald Trump was the best bet they have ever made. I think that even just in 2 short years, he has done more to advance the traditional platform of the Christian right than any other president they have backed, including Ronald Reagan, including George W. Bush. I mean, his appointments for the 2 Supreme Court slots that have come open have been absolutely right down the line of what the Christian right has desired. He's made a number of other much less famous appointments at the federal level, the level below our Supreme Court, that are going to be deeply influential along the same political lines. His decision to move the U.S. Embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem was a huge winning point for the Christian right. His decision to move away from the Obama administration's efforts to enforce protections, legal protections for gay and transgender people in the military and more broadly, in the context of public education, all of this, that also is something that for the Christian right signals maybe just a little bit of putting the brakes on the mainstreaming of this view of sexuality that they view as totally unbiblical. So very much, I mean, for those evangelicals who held their nose and voted for him because they hoped he would advance their agenda, they made the right decision. I mean, I think the reason for this is partly that Donald Trump actually doesn't personally care about any of this stuff. There's a very short list of issues that he actually cares about, that if you go back in his record, you can see he's had pretty consistent opinions on trade, things like this. But he was in a kind of unique position to just treat these decisions as purely bargaining chips to please his evangelical base. And so he's been much more hasty to do it, and his worldview is even more black and white than someone like Ronald Reagan or George W. Bush, who frankly, in retrospect, look like quite sophisticated, you know, diplomatic thinkers compared to our frame of reference now. So from the point of view of political pragmatism, the Christian right made a great bet.
Don't forget Pence.
Pence is a great, yes, don't forget Pence, yes.
That was a real, that was a real dog whistle to the evangelical.
Yes, that he would be willing to do this. A big Christian polling outfit just released a pretty detailed poll. They went back and asked evangelicals, okay, who did you vote for and why? And it was really interesting. It wasn't what I expected. The Pence bump, as the pollsters call it, was meaningful but relatively low on the list, so it made a difference for some evangelicals, but not an enormous number. Something like half of evangelicals who voted for Trump really thought of themselves as voting against Hillary. So I think that's important, although it might be splitting hairs. I'm not sure if we talk to them how much difference there would be between that and someone who saw themselves as really supporting Trump. I'll add too that the traditional culture wars issues ranked lower than immigration and improving the economic health of the country. And I've been thinking a lot about that. And I think that what that speaks to is that for many Trump voters, the issues like the legalization of abortion were in some ways subsumed by this broader sense that the culture is simply going in the wrong direction, and that they're losing this status that is has all sorts of features, and it's economic, and it has to do with what it means to be American, and the traditional culture wars, hot-button issues are part of that, but they're really part of this broader worldview and the sense of crisis. I'll add, too, that when this most recent survey asked evangelicals, would you vote for another party if the candidate were pro-life, a huge proportion of them, something like 2/3, said yes. So abortion remains a huge issue for evangelicals, and this points to another feature of the American political system, which is that we have seen some significant radicalization on the left that has sort of mirrored what we've seen on the right. At the same time that the Republican Party made opposition to legal abortion a major part of their platform, it became heresy in the Democratic Party to be a pro-life Democrat. So this has made it impossible for a lot of Christians who see themselves as consistent ethic of life Christians, who may indeed have a pretty progressive view of the social safety net and such, from joining the Democratic Party in a serious way, because they're treated like complete outcasts, and I think that's a real problem. I think, too, the left in America, this is true of in other countries as well, I think this is true in Canada, is riven by a kind of fracturing along identitarian lines that makes it very hard to create a national story about what it means to be American, what it means to be a patriot, what we can all be proud of, that really can answer in an effective way the Republican story.
You spoke of the evangelicals' faith in the unerring veracity of gospel. From the outside, it looks as if they are very selective in what they believe is unerringly correct, and what they seem to push hardest goes against the greater message of gospel. How can that be? The hypocrisy is it just hurts my head to wrap around that.
So the question is, how can evangelicals who claim to believe in the inerrancy of the Bible so frequently emphasize the inerrancy of the Genesis creation narrative, but put less emphasis on Galatians 3:28, there is neither slave nor free, man nor woman in me, but you are all one in Christ Jesus, or the Sermon on the Mount, and right, yes. So you have articulated the liberal Christian critique going back to the 19th century. You can see this in the fights over the abolition of slavery. An abolitionist would point to a verse like Galatians 3:28 and say, okay, yes, it's true that slavery as an institution is present in the Hebrew Bible. Paul accepts the existence of slavery, tells the slave to return to his master. However, some parts of Scripture need to be used to interpret other parts. And here in Galatians 3:28, we have what is a fundamental teaching of the gospel that needs to be used to put the rest of that in context. And the answer is original sin. I mean, that's the answer from the Christian perspective. The answer is that all human interpretation of Holy Scripture in every religious tradition is contextualized by historical and political self-interest and pressures in the moment. And the point of teaching my students history is to simply encourage them to see themselves, as we all should see ourselves, as historical creatures. I mean, the liberal modernist interpretation of Scripture is also fruit of historical context. I think that liberals are more comfortable accepting that there are kind of contradictory authorities in their world, and they have generally carved off certain realms for the authority of kind of secular enlightenment, empiricist pragmatism, science, the way we organize human communities, this increasing recognition of extending rights to a broader and broader community of people, while still accepting that Scripture contains a kind of a holy iteration of God's will in the words of fallible humans who were, trapped in the culture context of, first century Judea, or whatever, whichever book of the Bible you want to point to. Evangelicals don't accept that as easily, and I frankly respect their overt and sincere wrestling with the way these different authorities impinge upon us. I think sometimes modern people, we live in a state of kind of cognitive dissonance. We don't actually think too often about some of the contradictions in our own belief systems. However, the problem is that with that overt wrestling does not always come a sense of the other less than godly factors, like the desire to maintain power, that have shaped some of the interpretations of Scripture that they've inherited. I think humans all want power. Humans that don't have power interpret their world and create ideologies to justify the claiming of power, and humans who already have the power develop an ideology to defend that power. And I think you can be a devout member of whatever your religious community is and see that that's what humans do to God's holy word. God doesn't like that, but that's what happens. And so I try to make that point because I think it impedes the possibility of really reaching conservative evangelicals to suggest that they are the only white supremacists in history and they are the only bigots in history, right? What the story I'm telling you is this particular iteration of just the universal pattern across the history of our species.
I'd like to hear your reaction to the seeming fascination of Trump for strong men, strong political men that authoritarian
The question is what to make of Trump's fascination with strong men around the world, Putin, the Saudi royalty, and so forth. Well, I've been doing a lot of reading lately into some of the social psychology that came out in the wake of World War II, trying to make sense of how so many seemingly ordinary people could have zealously subscribed to fascist ideology. There was a big study called the Authoritarian Personality that made the argument that this attraction is not a matter of politics. It has some sort of deeper psychological component. And I find that very interesting. I think there's no doubt that if Trump weren't, confined by the rule of law that still does exist in my country, he would absolutely have no qualms about taking many of the measures that someone like Putin takes. And what's interesting too is that whatever the insecurities and the kind of psychology that might inform that in the case of Donald Trump, what's interesting is the reaction of his followers to his admiration for Putin. It wasn't that long ago that the Cold War was still on, and the glue that made the modern American conservative movement possible was anti-communism. I mean, that's what allowed the libertarians to really collaborate with the Christian conservatives and so forth. And so it's very, very interesting to see that entirely cast aside. And this love for Putin does not seem to trouble conservatives who not so long ago had so many nasty things to say about the Soviet Union and Soviet authoritarianism. I think that some of the social psychology on this is persuasive. That for some people, the threat of a distant strong man is not really such a threat, not compared to their sense of what's happening to their own country. And admiring the strong man allows a kind of sense of participating in his power. Trump can't stand weakness. He can't stand any people who seem weak or are marginalized. And this is one way of describing the kind of us versus them rhetoric that he's so skilled at. And it is something I think you can see as a feature in his peer strongmen around the world. But for his followers, they're not so troubled. They're more troubled by issues closer to home. And they kind of, when they squint and look at Putin from Trump's angle, they see something, pretty impressive and admirable too, I think. This is not a subject on which I've interviewed evangelicals. This is just my casual observation. But this is also a historical pattern, that repeats itself in human history.
Could you speak to the movements within evangelical Christianity, whether they be white Christians or not, in opposition to Trump, the red letter Christians or the Republicans campaign?
The question is, what about the dissenters in American evangelicalism who are continuing to resist Trump? And how might we describe some of this? I found I've kind of made a bit of a sideline writing little essays where I tried to seek out some of these people to sort of remind, New York Times readers that, Franklin Graham is not actually representative of all evangelicals and that there is a complexity here. Certainly you find a lot of dissenters and people we could loosely call evangelicals of color, even though many of them, as I said, reject that term. They have a lot of theological common ground with white evangelicals. They're often quite conservative on these cultural issues, sexuality and so forth, but they have no illusions about the strain of white supremacy that sort of runs through this. They're not willing to prioritize these culture wars, fights over broader questions of social justice. And one very interesting, I think inspiring case has unfolded in my state, North Carolina. There's a preacher in North Carolina named William Barber, who until very recently led the North Carolina chapter of the NAACP, one of the kind of historic civil rights organizations in the United States. But he's stepped down from that and he's devoted himself for the past, since before Trump, since about 2012, because a kind of pre-Trump movement was brewing in North Carolina, so it made him a bit of ahead of the curve. He's tried to create a really broad coalition, and he likes to say, I am the fundamentalist. I am, the biblical literalist, for precisely the point that was raised earlier, that he believes in stressing all these other tenets that are so clear in Jesus' concern for the poor and so forth. But he has made a point of not drawing strict religious boundaries and trying to bring in not only all kinds of Christians, but non-believers, anyone who is sort of on board with the general message of caring for the least of these. And he's gone on a kind of national tour that has gotten some attention. I don't see it steamrolling toward an immediate victory in the midterms. Here's my broad assessment. I think there are some encouraging trends in the appeal of a message of someone like William Barber among younger evangelicals. And because America is browning, just as Canada is, as a greater proportion of our population is non-white, I think we will see a political change follow that. However, I also think that the Christian right in the United States is incredibly well organized, and they will continue to punch above their weight politically for a very long time to come. They'll have kind of disproportionate political influence. There are structural reasons for this. Republicans in the United States have been ingenious at gerrymandering political districts, so they've really reduced, even though, my state, North Carolina, is almost exactly evenly split between Democrats and Republicans, our state legislature is dominated by Republicans because they draw these crazy districts that, group all the black people in one area in like a tiny line running along the highway and concentrate their vote to elect one representative rather than 5. Or, the cities, although they are the concentrated populations, don't get, proportionate representation and so forth. But there are these encouraging signs. When I go to Christian colleges, I'm continually amazed Christian liberal arts colleges that in many ways are very conservative, that still, have rules surrounding what gay students can do and so forth, that often have language about inerrancy in their statements of faith. When I talk to faculty there are so many who are horrified by Donald Trump. When I talk to students, they're really interested in exploring some of the other kind of historical avenues of ways of thinking about Christianity and its relationship to culture, whether it's the Anabaptist tradition or Pietism or the Wesleyan tradition that I spoke about. And they're kind of working these things out in the context of flesh and blood relationships with gay friends, with Christians who are not white. They are growing up in a more pluralistic environment, many of them, and I think that those relationships are informing their reading of Scripture. But I think it's going to be a long time before we see a real shift. Over the long haul, I am confident that the United States has had this kind of exceptional period in its history where it's been a kind of outlier among its peer countries in the developed West in terms of the vibrance of religion and the power of organized religion, and also the kind of libertarian, very puny welfare state. But I think over the long haul of a couple of centuries, the broader features shaping our civilization are stronger than the historical features that have made the United States exceptional and are pulling us back into line gradually with Canada and with Western Europe.
We have time for a couple more questions. I saw Tim had another question, but I wanted to make sure, I know there's a number of people sitting in the aisles and around the corner where I can't see. Is there anyone that's was out of my sight line that has a question or a comment they'd like to make? We're good? All right, so let's go with Tim and then we'll go to Librar.
I was just going to say that given how eloquently you answered my first question, could it not be that as far as the issue of the strongman dictators around the world goes, his base is simply willing to say, I'm going to ignore everything that could be a threat and don't rock the boat?
The question is, could it be that evangelicals are pleased with the way Trump has advanced a lot of their policy vision, and so when these things come up that maybe they're not thrilled about, do they just overlook it? Yeah, I think that's fair. And while we're back on the subject of his attitude towards strongmen, I'll take this opportunity to highlight what I think is a very ingenious paradox in Trump's rhetoric. So on the one hand, he thinks of himself as a strongman. He's this wannabe strongman who should be riding tigers bare-chested with Putin, although there does have to be a lot more photoshopping involved for him to look as muscular, right? But at the same time, another piece of his effectiveness is his ability to channel his supporters' sense of victimization. So he's always saying it's not fair, and unflattering information comes out. The New York Times finds that his family committed all this tax fraud. It's not fair. I've been screwed over. That's exactly how his supporters feel. They feel that the system has screwed them over, that these newcomers to the country or, black beneficiaries of affirmative action have jumped the line and have gotten these advantages that they didn't work for. And here they've worked hard, and they've worked just as hard as their fathers, and they're not able to provide in the same way. Now, they're not wrong about the reality of their own situation. It's crappy. And we know, right? We know that there are these global reasons for it. It's not just an American story. It's exacerbated by American policy. So they are reacting to something real about their own situation. And Trump's ability to simultaneously give them a sense of strength, and then by turns also validate their sense of being the victim by speaking as a victim himself, has just been, I think, a winning combination among a huge swath of American voters.
Well, yeah, my question connects to that a bit. Tapping into, the author that, sort of the age of anger, the age of rage, the history of the present. So tapping into rage and anger. So how do you put that together, with supposedly being compassionate, forgiving, etc., in the evangelical tradition? So, how do people justify their rage?
How do evangelicals who are supposed to be meek and mild justify their rage? That's the question. I think the whole 2,000 years of Christian history is one long demonstration of the fact that no matter what their stated religious convictions might be, Christians are not really any better than anyone else at controlling their less admirable reactions to things. And the whole argument that you need to be a Christian to be a moral person is just perverse when you look at the historical record. And I think in the more immediate historical context, the willingness of evangelicals to validate their own anger and perhaps not interrogate it as an outsider might think that they should, is perhaps enhanced by the crisis of masculinity I described to you, the sense that Christians are fighters. And there's an enormous diversity, in ways of being a Christian male leader in the evangelical world. I don't want to exaggerate the significance of this one strain, but it is certainly there. And it is perhaps another way in which evangelicals recognize the anger and the kind of aggressiveness of Donald Trump. I mean, you can point to a tradition of kind of fundamentalist warlord type leaders who enjoyed great authority over their own religious fiefdom and had a great following and no interest in being accountable to anyone. And so in that sense, there is a kind of tradition of evangelical leadership that Trump fits into, certainly not perfectly, but there's a resemblance. But I think the broader answer is that this is a failure one could notice in any number of gaps between our ideals and our actions.
Maybe time for one more comment.
I get the feeling that Trump's way of painting Canada black is his way of pulling evangelicals into his camp. Is that fair?
The question is Trump's policies towards Canada, his rhetoric about Canada, a kind of sop to his evangelical followers? That's interesting. I think maybe in part the ways in which his policy toward Canada is I think one of the few places in his conduct where he has shown some consistency over his career. So he has this protectionist attitude. And also I'll say that he views any kind of diplomatic negotiation as a real estate deal, right? So, he goes into it with kind of that attitude, and he has a sort of simplistic understanding of, the chips on the table and what you'll pay, and I can wring a little bit more out of you, and I'm going to wait until I do that. So he has no, all of the nice things that liberal Americans, cried in protest about the long tradition of collaboration with our closest ally and all of this, and then also the reality of the shared economy and the completely intertwined nature of our economies fell on two very deaf ears, I think, in his case, and those of some key advisors who are pushing him on this. But I think you are onto something in that what Canada represents, to the extent that the Americans I'm talking about think about Canada, which is not as much as they really ought to, if at all. The things that you are proud of, the multicultural, heritage and the sense that there can be a kind of unified national pride that is also pluralistic. This is deeply threatening, and it's important to recognize too that there are important communities within Canada who are deeply threatened by that as well, and are not, and there's a lot of intertwined collaboration and shared intellectual and institutional heritage between Canadian evangelicals and American evangelicals. A lot of Canadian evangelicals go to American institutions and so forth. So, I don't mean to suggest to you that we can sort of draw a bright line here, but I think you're right that the advent of Trump helps us see in stark relief some of these divergences in these two cultures, north and south of the border.
Let's, okay, one more question.
Well, and I'll be around,
Yeah,
right?
we'll
I mean,
be
I'll be
too.
around.
So, because I know your voices, we want to respect your voice
Thanks.
and your cold. Maybe we will. You can be the first in line to say hello to Molly afterwards. Let's give her a good north of the border